Let's talk about S-Corps. And this one will bring out all the CPAs and we'll all fight over what's the best. An S-Corp is a little bit more of an art form than a lot of other things in tax. And so you'll find a million and one different opinions when you're talking about S-Corps. S-Corps is a tax designation, not a legal one. So there's no legal advantages to an S-Corp. But there are some downside and some positive sides and some additional costs that you need to be aware of before you elect it. For a lot of law firms, I do recommend being an S-Corp. We'll go through the downsides and you'll kind of see why. So here's some of the downsides. So no more than 100 partners. And this is usually not really a concern for the small to medium-sized firms. This can get into an issue with huge national firms, but for the most part, 100 partners is pretty well managed to keep under. You do have to pay yourself a reasonable compensation, and that's important to know. You can't pay yourself $1, but we also don't want to pay ourselves 100% of the profits of the firm. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. We do need to stay for 5 years as an S-Corp once elected. This can be a concern if you want to kind of come in and out of an S-Corp. That's a little bit of an issue. This is a long-term decision. It's not just a this year decision. You can't have any foreign partners. So if you're doing immigration, you can't bring on a foreign partner as part of your firm. So this is applicable to some international firms or immigration firms. I've seen this as an issue. I usually recommend not holding any assets if you're an S-Corp. So this means I wouldn't put specifically real estate in the S-Corp because as you distribute that real estate, it causes a taxable event, which we want to avoid if we can. So a lot of law firms do own the building that they're in. We would just create a separate entity for that asset. And then some retirement accounts can be limited by reasonable compensation. So if you're paying yourself $100,000, oftentimes you can be limited to 25% of that to donate or to contribute to your retirements. Whereas if your reasonable compensation is $500,000, that obviously will increase the amount that you're able to contribute, but it could limit the benefits of being an S-Corp, right? So again, run through this with a CPA, really understand the numbers and if it is applicable to you specifically. So some of the positives. Positives, it mitigates self-employment tax, which is 15.3% on the first $185,000 in 2026. This is inflation adjusted, so bear that in mind. But then above that, it mitigates an extra 3.8% above $200,000. For single filers, it's different for married filed jointly. There are lots of caveats and rules around this, but just for our purposes, generally it's going to save you 15.3% in taxes or 4% in taxes, right? And so those are kind of the numbers we're looking at, which can add up to be quite a bit. And so if you're looking at $100,000 in earnings, right, if we could theoretically save that 3.8%, that's $3,800. So generally speaking, and again, this is not for everyone, but generally I usually see about $10,000 to $20,000 in savings for an S-Corp for a lawyer. Again, this is not for everyone. I'm not going to say that you will always save this amount, but that's generally what I see when I'm working with the firms that I work with. There are additional costs that are involved. Payroll service, usually not an issue if you're already paying an admin or a paralegal. This is really only like $6 to $10, right? So this is pretty minimal in expenses for payroll service. And it does cost extra for your CPA, right? So if your CPA is doing a partnership return, usually it's going to be about the same for an S corporation. But if you're just an LLC, Schedule C tax filer, this is going to increase your tax bill quite a bit. I usually charge 2 to 3 times more for S Corps plus personal than I do for just personal. But that's again, just me, and it can depend on your situation. But please talk to your CPA about this. And I do want to make sure that you understand there are extra costs. So generally, when I say $10,000 to $20,000 in savings, some of that is additional expenses you have to pay, but generally I see still $10,000 to $20,000 in total savings, even after these additional costs. All right, so we kind of covered the downsides, we covered the positives and some of the additional costs. I do want to talk about a little bit about reasonable compensation because this is usually where people mess up. For instance, I saw a law firm the other day who was paying themselves a salary that mitigated all the benefits of an S-Corp. They were paying themselves well over $1 million and causing a lot of issues because they weren't taking advantage of the tax savings from an S-Corp. And again, that's the whole purpose of being an S-Corp. If you're not going to take advantage of those savings, then we should be a partnership or a Schedule C law firm instead, because like we talked about the downsides, there's a lot more complexity that goes into an S-Corp, or a lot more rules around it that are going to limit our ability to function as a business. And so if we're not taking advantage of the taxes, why are we doing it, right? So I've seen that before where they're paying themselves way too much on their W-2, which is then causing problems. And then I've also seen the other side where they're paying themselves $3,000, which is not reasonable compensation. So that would definitely flag you with the IRS, and that could initiate an audit. This could cause a lot of problems. So $3,000 for a salary for a lawyer is not enough. And then $1 million is way too much, right? And so we have to find that balance. And that's where a reasonable comp study comes from. And I do all these in-house. I really recommend people do a reasonable comp study. If you haven't done one and you're just throwing a dart at a dartboard, it's not good enough. We have to know how much we should pay ourselves and not just take a gamble. So there are two approaches that I want to talk about. The most common, I think, is the cost approach. And this is really if you're a solo lawyer, small firm, you're wearing multiple hats. You're doing the marketing, you're doing the admin work, you're calling the clients, you're doing the sales, you're actually being a lawyer, right? So this approach is really, really helpful for those type of attorneys. And what this is doing is we're taking a salary for each of those roles. So if you are doing admin for 5 hours a week and you're doing marketing for 2 hours a week, you're doing IT for an hour, you're doing bookkeeping, your own bookkeeping for 2 hours a week, we can kind of add that all up and say, okay, how much does that cost to replace? And then we can add in how much time you're being a lawyer, because usually it's like half the amount of time, or half the time you're being a lawyer, maybe up to 75% being a lawyer, and most of the time is spent on other administration tasks in the firm. So we can decrease your salary that way, and it's a great approach that I really recommend, again, for those small firms, solo firms, or maybe up to, I don't know, a few $1 million in revenue. I think the cost approach can be really, really beneficial. The other approach is the market approach. And the market approach is really just replacing yourself with somebody else. This is really helpful if you're basically just being a lawyer all day, every day. I can guarantee you that you probably wouldn't bring someone in at $1 million a year to be a lawyer. Maybe they would get there with bonuses and everything like that. But generally speaking, a salary for a lawyer is not $1 million, at least non-partner, I should say. So what we're going to do is we're going to calculate and replace you with someone else, hypothetically. And how much would you pay them? And this can range pretty drastically, right? If you're in litigation constantly, this can be pretty expensive, which is why the cost approach is really good if you're not being a lawyer full time. But if your firm is producing $5 to $10 million a year and you're a rainmaker, you're bringing in most of that money and you're trying the cases and you're doing really well, what we can do is say, hey, instead of taking a salary of $1 million or paying yourself $1 million, we can pay yourself $500,000 and then take that extra 4% on $500,000 as savings. Does this solve every issue? No. And again, I ask to please talk with someone who does this constantly and is meeting with lawyers on a constant basis to go through this, because there are some real advantages to being an S-Corp and there are some real downsides. And it's not for everyone, but I encourage you to at least take a look at it because it really can save you a lot of money. Just be careful because CPAs do charge more for an S-Corp filing. We oftentimes in the industry will just put everyone, hey, you need to be an S-Corp, you need to be an S-Corp, without really helping them understand the benefits and the negatives. And every situation is different. So again, please talk with a professional before electing an S-Corp. But if that all sounds reasonable, now's the time to start thinking about it. Usually an S-Corp election needs to be done between January 1st and March 15th of the year. And so we still have a little bit of time now to prep for next year, but I would encourage you to take a look and see if your situation fits.